Is it me, or are the Trailblazer quests getting shorter and shorter? In the past, I made a video discussing how quickly the story wrapped up in 1.2. At the time, given the story didn't really end yet and it went into an interlude with no clear conclusion in place, I held off on commenting on it any further. I figured that if there was any story left that cleared up the xianzhou storyline and some of its character plots like Jingliu and Lo Cha, it was going to happen in Kafka's patch. But it didn't. With 1.3's release, we finally get a conclusion to the xianzhou luofu storyline, but somehow it's even shorter than the 1.2 story. So let's take a deeper look into this. Was there a reason this was as short as it was, or is this a sign of things to come? Before we do though, if you want to see more Honkai Star Rail content, do consider subscribing to the channel. Let me first preface this video before I go on to what will seem like a rant to some of you. I'm not discussing this topic just for the sake of crapping on the game. I enjoy both Star Rail and Genshin Impact quite a bit and have been playing Star Rail since its launch, and I mostly enjoy it for its story. But sometimes, it's difficult to defend something like this given the length and content that we got here. Take for example the discussion I had about the story in 1.2. Yes, I mentioned that it was shorter than I expected, but my playthrough of it was still enjoyable. There were twists, new characters, we learned new lore on Danheng, and saw a destruction emanator in the flesh, despite the shorter duration of the Trailblazer quest. So there was good and bad. But the conclusion we got in 1.3 leaves a lot to be desired, and even I'm finding out that I'm grasping at straws when trying to speak positively about it. What we got was essentially an epilogue. The story was split into three main parts: a recap with Fu Xuan, Tingyuns' funeral, and a somewhat quick wrap-up by Jingyuan. That's basically it. You were given the option to speak to everyone involved as an optional part of the quest before the main character left the xianzhou luofu, but you didn't really need it to, and it didn't really add anything further, at least lore-wise. The conversation with Fu Xuan was also really weirdly added as well, because it seemed to me like more of a previous episode recap. I didn't really see the point of this, as we just finished the quest in 1.2 only a couple of weeks ago, and made me think it was just padding to stretch out what was already a short epilogue. I was just a bit confused why a refresher was even needed. Perhaps it's to just update us on Fu Xuan's new role and position, but who knows. Jingyuan's closing ceremony was also pretty quickly handled, but maybe that's because he's supposed to be in bed recuperating. He functionally thanks the Nameless for their support and reaffirms that we are now official friends of the xianzhou luofu, and even gave us a beacon to directly contact him should we ever need help. Jingyuan goes on to mention that the Stellaron still hasn't been located and Danheng's crimes are absolved, and that's it. The main character and the Nameless say their goodbyes, get on the Astral Express, and await the conductor's instruction to move on to the next planet. The only thing that was decent throughout this Trailblazer quest, at least to me, was Tingyun's funeral. It was sort of touching and a little bit sad to see the many different people Tingyun had interacted with and affected while on the xianzhou luofu, and while her whereabouts are currently unknown, there was some closure here despite everybody seeming pretty depressed about hearing about her death. Yukong also ends up mentioning that she will personally find what exactly happened to the Tingyun they all knew, for better or worse, likely setting up a potential future story thread. We didn't really get a lore dump or anything, and it ended just abruptly. Now, if I were thinking in a more positive light, I might say something along the lines of, again, 1.3 isn't really over, and there might be more to come during Fu Xuan's banner or even in 1.4, since we know Jingliu's banner is appearing. But the last time I made this assumption, it didn't really work out that way, and with how this story ended, the Nameless are functionally just waiting for the next step. Now, I didn't forget, I'm aware of that cutscene at the end with Lo Cha and Jingliu, and I do have some ideas I'd like to share about this, but probably in a different video. However, as it stands, the cutscene is functionally just a cliffhanger. We don't know when this particular story will be explored in the future or how it will tie to the current events of the Nameless, since we are preparing to go somewhere else entirely. Maybe these characters will appear on the other planet that we will go to or something, but I don't know. I'm not saying the cutscene itself wasn't interesting and thought-provoking, but despite the xianzhou luofu storyline ending, we didn't really get to learn anything more about Lo Cha, Jingliu, the High Cloud Quintet, or anything else, at least as part of the main story. What could potentially happen here, given we know what banners are coming out in the second half of 1.3 and the entirety of 1.4, perhaps the characters we see at the end of the cutscene will end up delaying the Nameless from actually leaving. Maybe it was a mislead where we think that the Nameless are moving on, but in truth, the chaos isn't truly over and they're pulled right back into it. Alternatively, this could be a potential diverging story point where we occasionally get updates on what these other characters are doing, while the main character has their own story somewhere else, much like Dainsleif in Genshin Impact. If we examine the xianzhou luofu storyline in its entirety, this could be an issue of just bad pacing and planning rather than the story itself being bad. Maybe the release schedule was not planned properly, making the xianzhou story in 1.0 feel a lot longer than the subsequent releases in 1.2 and in 1.3. It also makes me wonder whether this arrangement was purely because of planning around banner releases rather than what made sense for the story. What's also interesting is the fact that right after the 1.3 patch was released and people started voicing their opinions on the length of the story, Hoyoverse uncapped some of their event gameplay. Essentially, in Genshin Impact and even in Star Rail, some events have time-locked activities, meaning you couldn't clear everything on day 1 and you had to wait, sort of an artificial way of prolonging the event. Some have mentioned that this was more of a quality of life improvement, though others have speculated that this was actually a reaction to the player-based comments on the short story length. They claim that Hoyoverse only uncapped the event quests just so people had something to do. I don't know what the real reason is here, but it does seem to come at a time where there's functionally very little story content for what is supposed to be a mainline patch. Now let's bring all of this to an end. The Trailblazer quest in 1.3 is exceptionally short and doesn't really function to set anything up for the main character except for the next planet and Eon they will be involved with. It really makes me wonder why they even split it up in this way instead of just ending all of this in 1.2. Again, my guess is they wanted the story to somehow coincide with some character releases, but even then, it's not like Imbiber Lune had anything specific or significant to do during this particular ending/epilogue. It's kind of worrying to me as I'm invested in these games mostly for the story, and if it continues to become shorter in the future, then I hope other things are added to make up for it. But I'm not just going to doom post, and maybe I'll take in a little bit of copium here. I still enjoy the game, though much like an addict, I wish there was a bit more. Also, we maybe have to kind of remember this is technically an ending, so maybe a shorter length is somewhat justified, but I'm not sure about that. Hopefully, the story doesn't just end this way, and if it really is the ending, then we can only hope that the next planet is a bit more well planned in terms of its releases and length. Let me know in the comments if you were disappointed with the 1.3 Trailblazer quest or if you weren't. I'll end the video here, and if you enjoyed it, do consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for watching and have a nice day.